My name is Patrick Hayes, but most people just call me Pat. I'm 41, and this happened last October. I'd taken some time off from my long-haul trucking job to clear my head after my divorce. Driving across the country for a living had always been my escape, but now, with nothing to go back home to, even the open road wasn't enough. I needed solitude, space to think. That's how I ended up at Devil's Hollow in the Ochako National Forest, Oregon, a remote, off-grid campground I'd read about online. The articles described it as hauntingly beautiful, and a challenge for seasoned campers. Perfect, I thought. Just what I needed. I wasn't looking for comfort, and I sure as hell wasn't scared off by the stories of the woman in black. Local legends never bothered me much. Ghost stories were just that, stories. But by the time I left Devil's Hollow, I wasn't so sure anymore. The drive into the campground was rough. The dirt road twisted through dense forest, the pines closing in like towering sentinels. My RV, a reliable old beast that had seen better days, struggled over the ruts, and I was starting to wonder if I'd made a mistake. Then, finally, the trees parted to reveal a small, overgrown clearing with a faded wooden sign, Devil's Hollow Campground. The place was deserted. Not a single other camper in sight. That suited me fine. I parked the RV near a cluster of trees and stepped out to take in the quiet. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of pine needles and moss. There were no sounds, no birds, no insects, just a strange, oppressive silence. I shook it off and got to work setting up. The generator sputtered to life but ran inconsistently, and my water supply was leaking from somewhere. Annoying, but manageable. I wasn't here for comfort, after all. The sun set quickly, and the clearing was swallowed by shadows. I built a small fire and sat by it, staring into the flames. It had been a long time since I'd been alone with my thoughts, and the quiet felt unnatural. Around midnight, I saw her for the first time. I was gazing into the forest when something flickered at the edge of my vision. A figure, vague, distant, standing just beyond the firelight. My heart skipped. I squinted, trying to make out the details. It was a woman, dressed in what looked like a long black dress. Her head was tilted slightly, and she didn't move. "Hello?" I called out, my voice rough in the stillness. She didn't respond, didn't even flinch. I stood, my skin crawling. "Hey, are you lost?" Still nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, but the beam flickered and died before it could reach her. When I looked back, she was gone. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, my imagination playing games in the dark. But deep down, I knew better. The next day, I explored the area, trying to shake the unease. The trees were dense, the underbrush thick with ferns and brambles. I found a narrow path leading toward a ravine. The ground was damp, and my boots sank into the mud as I walked. At the bottom of the ravine, a shallow stream trickled over rocks, its sound strangely muted. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I noticed a faint blue glow deep in the woods. It flickered like a lantern, swaying gently as if someone were carrying it. I stood and watched, entranced. "Who the hell is out there?" I muttered. I grabbed my flashlight and started toward the light, my boots crunching through the undergrowth. But the glow retreated, moving deeper into the forest. I followed it, stumbling over roots and rocks. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished, leaving me alone in the dark. The forest felt alive around me, whispers in the wind, branches creaking overhead. Panic set in as I realized I'd lost my bearings. After what felt like hours, I found my way back to the RV, shaken and exhausted. That night, the whispers started. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I lay in the RV, staring at the ceiling, trying to block them out. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the RV. I bolted upright, heart pounding. I grabbed a flashlight and knife, threw open the door, and shone the light outside. Nothing. Just the clearing, bathed in pale moonlight. But when I looked down, I saw them. Muddy footprints leading away into the forest. They were small, like a child's, and impossibly fresh. On the third night, she came closer. I was sitting by the fire staring into the flames when I felt it. A presence. I looked up, and there she was, standing at the edge of the clearing. This time, I could see her face, or what should have been her face. Instead, there was only darkness beneath the veil. She raised a hand, her long fingers pointing toward the ravine. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. She just stood there, motionless, her hand outstretched. And then, as if carried by the wind, I heard her voice. "Come." The word echoed in my head, pulling at me, filling me with an overwhelming urge to follow her. I stumbled to my feet, my legs moving involuntarily. But before I could take another step, the fire flared, sending sparks into the air. The woman vanished. By this point, I knew I had to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine coughed and sputtered, refusing to turn over. My phone was dead, and my compass spun uselessly. It was as if the forest itself wanted to keep me here. Desperate, I remembered a story I'd read online about an old shrine somewhere near the hollow, a place locals believed could appease the woman's spirit. I decided to find it. Following the ravine, I eventually came across the shrine, a crumbling pile of stones, half buried in moss. Strange symbols were etched into the rocks, similar to the footprints and patterns I'd seen. The air around the shrine was thick, buzzing with static energy. As I stood there, the blue light appeared again, hovering above the shrine. And then she emerged from the shadows. The woman in black stepped closer, her veil lifting to reveal a face that wasn't human. Her skin was gray and sunken, her eyes hollow pits that burned with faint light. She reached out toward me, her hand impossibly long, her fingers curling like claws. I panicked, searching for something, anything to stop her. Then I remembered the stories about offerings. Without thinking, I pulled my wedding ring from my finger, the last tie to a life I was trying to leave behind, and placed it on the shrine. "Take it," I whispered. "Just leave me alone." The woman paused, her form flickering like a dying flame. The forest erupted with noise, howling wind, cracking branches, whispers rising into a deafening cacophony. I fell to my knees, covering my ears, and then silence. When I looked up, she was gone. At dawn, the RV started without a hitch. The GPS came back online, showing the route to the nearest town. I didn't question it. I drove until the forest was a distant memory. Even now, I can't explain what happened at Devil's Hollow, but I know one thing for sure: I'm never going back. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear her voice calling me, and every so often I catch myself looking for that blue light. My name is Elena Torres, and I'm 28. This happened in late October of last year during a solo camping trip at Lost Creek Campground in the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, Oregon. I was there for my blog, Nomadic Whispers, a project I'd built from scratch, turning everyday camping trips into captivating stories for my growing audience. This time, I was chasing something a little darker, local folklore about ghostly children who haunted the area. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. But stories about hauntings always brought traffic to my site. Besides, the campground was picturesque, tucked away in a forest of towering pines and crossed by a gentle, babbling creek. I figured even if the ghost stories were nonsense, I'd get some great photos and a peaceful weekend in nature. But I was wrong. So wrong. The drive into the campground was beautiful, with sunlight streaming through the autumn leaves. When I arrived, I was surprised to find the place completely empty. No other RVs, no tents, no people. Just me and the trees. At check-in, the ranger raised an eyebrow when I mentioned staying at Lost Creek. He looked me up and down like he was assessing whether I could handle being alone out here. "Not many folks come through this time of year," he said. His voice had a weight to it, like he wanted to say more but decided against it. "Stay safe." I laughed it off, confident that my years of solo travel had prepared me for anything. By the time I parked my RV and set up camp, the sun was sinking behind the treetops, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I spent the evening photographing the creek, which was unusually still, its surface smooth like glass. It reflected the dense forest and scattered clouds perfectly, but the water itself smelled off. A faint, metallic tang lingered in the air. When night fell, I built a small fire and started drafting a blog post about my first impressions of the place. The silence was uncanny. There weren't even the usual sounds of crickets or owls, just the crackling of my fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time. Faint laughter. It was so distant I almost thought I'd imagined it. Children laughing, high-pitched and echoing, carried on the breeze. It came from the direction of the creek. I froze, my fingers hovering over my keyboard. "You're hearing things, Elena," I whispered to myself. But a part of me couldn't let it go. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the water. The laughter stopped as soon as I reached the bank. The creek was still dark and silent. I went back to the RV, but I barely slept that night. The next morning, I stepped outside to find something that sent a chill down my spine. Small, wet footprints surrounded my fire pit and led right up to the RV. They were unmistakably made by bare feet. They stopped abruptly at the door, as if whoever, or whatever, made them, had vanished into thin air. I took photos for my blog, convincing myself it was a prank. Maybe the ranger had kids who thought it'd be funny to spook a camper. Still, the sense of unease grew. While exploring the area later, I noticed strange symbols carved into the trees around the campground. They were rough circles, intersected by jagged lines, almost like someone had slashed at the bark with a knife. I uploaded photos of the symbols to my blog draft, noting how they gave the forest an unnerving atmosphere. That evening, I sat by the fire, trying to write, when movement caught my eye. Across the creek, just at the edge of the tree line, stood a small figure. A child, no older than 8, wearing a tattered white dress. Her hair was matted, and her face was hidden in shadow. "Hello," I called out, standing up. My voice cracked with tension. The figure didn't move. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it across the creek, but the beam flickered and died. When I looked back, the child was gone. I spent the rest of the evening locked inside the RV, curtains drawn, every light turned on. But the lights didn't stop the scratching. It started around midnight. Faint, deliberate scrapes against the sides of the RV like fingernails dragging across metal. I held my breath, clutching a knife I kept in my gear. The scratches moved, first on the left side, then the right, then up near the roof. I never heard footsteps, just the scratching. By the third day, I was desperate to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered uselessly and my GPS had stopped working. Even my phone had no signal, which wasn't unusual for remote areas, but it felt like the forest itself was trapping me. I returned to the creek to take more photos, hoping to distract myself. The water was different now, no longer still and reflective. It was murky and dark, swirling as though something moved beneath the surface. When I leaned in closer, I swore I saw a hand reaching out, pale and skeletal, before the water stilled again. I stumbled back, heart racing. It's just your imagination, I told myself. But deep down, I knew better. That night, the laughter returned, louder and closer. This time, there were voices too, whispering just outside the RV. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was insistent, almost pleading. I peeked out the window, my breath fogging the glass. The fire pit was glowing faintly, though I hadn't lit a fire. Around it stood 3 children, their faces blank and pale. One of them, a boy with hollow eyes, turned toward me and grinned. "Play with us," he said, his voice echoing like it was coming from inside my head. I slammed the curtain shut and backed away, my pulse pounding. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until I screamed, "Leave me alone!" And then silence. The next morning, I found a small memorial plaque hidden near the creek. It was overgrown with moss, but I managed to clean it enough to read the inscription. In memory of the children lost to the creek, October 1957. Their laughter will echo forever. A chill ran through me as I realized the stories were true. Decades ago, a bus carrying schoolchildren had skidded off the road and plunged into the creek. Most of the children drowned, their bodies swept away by the current. The few survivors claimed to hear laughter in the water, but no one believed them. As the sun set, I felt a shift in the air. The forest seemed darker, heavier. I knew I had to confront whatever was haunting me or I wouldn't make it out alive. I gathered my notebook, which had somehow been filled with scrawled messages I didn't remember writing. Join us. Play with us. Forever. I carried it to the creek, where the children waited, their forms barely solid, like mist given shape. The hollow-eyed boy stepped forward. "Stay," he said. "We need you." "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You don't belong here, and neither do I." Desperately, I threw the notebook into the water. The creek bubbled violently and the children screamed, a sound that pierced my very soul. Their forms twisted, melting into the swirling water until the creek was still once more. When I returned to the RV, it started on the first try. The GPS flickered back to life, showing the route to the nearest town. I didn't question it, I just drove. But even now, a year later, I can't shake the feeling that I didn't escape entirely. Sometimes when I'm alone, I hear faint laughter, and every now and then I wake to find small wet footprints on my floor. My name is Maggie Hartwell. I'm 32, and this happened in late September 2 years ago, deep in the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest in Oregon. I've told myself over and over that I was imagining things, that it couldn't have been real, but every time I close my eyes I see her again, and I can still hear Beth's screams. I'm an environmental scientist, the kind of person who's far more comfortable in the field than behind a desk. That's why I'd organized the trip, a research weekend in the Wallowas to collect soil and water samples for a climate project. With me were Beth, my eager but inexperienced grad student, Jordan, my best friend and former paramedic, and Tyler, a wildlife photographer I barely knew. Tyler had tagged along last minute, offering to help document the trip in exchange for exclusive access to the area. It was supposed to be routine, like countless other trips I'd done. But this one went wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. We arrived late Friday afternoon, parking the van at the edge of the Devil's Wash Trail. The name had come up during my research. A narrow ravine, deep in the forest, notorious for strange disappearances. Locals had warned us to stay away, but I wasn't one to buy into ghost stories. Urban legends, I'd told the others. Nothing to worry about. The hike to our campsite took longer than expected. Beth struggled with her overloaded pack, and Jordan kept grumbling about the uneven trail. Tyler, who'd said maybe 2 words since we'd met, walked silently behind us, his camera swinging from his neck. We reached the campsite just as the sun dipped below the mountains. The clearing was small, surrounded by towering pines with a view of the ravine just beyond. It was breathtaking. Jagged cliffs, shadows stretching like long fingers across the forest floor. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Tyler said, breaking his silence. He stared at the ravine, his expression unreadable, almost too perfect. We set up camp quickly, 3 tents around a modest fire. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sound. Crickets chirped, and an occasional owl hooted in the distance. It was comforting, in a way, the kind of ambiance I'd grown used to in the field. But as the night deepened, the noises shifted. The crickets fell silent, replaced by a faint humming sound. It came from the direction of the ravine, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. "What's that?" Beth asked, her voice trembling. "Wind," I said, though even I didn't believe it. Jordan shook his head. "Wind doesn't hum." Tyler said nothing. He just stared into the dark, his hand tightening on his camera. The next morning, Beth noticed something strange. On the trees near our campsite, someone, or something, had carved circular symbols. They were crude, but deliberate, like overlapping spirals. Beth thought they were fascinating, snapping photos for her notes. Jordan wasn't as amused. "That's not graffiti," he muttered. "That's a warning." "A warning for what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't want to feed into his paranoia, but the symbols did feel off. "Bad things happen when people ignore warnings," he replied. We continued with our work, though the atmosphere had changed. Tyler, normally reserved, became increasingly jittery. He kept glancing over his shoulder, muttering under his breath. And then there was Beth, who couldn't stop talking about the ravine. She wanted to explore it, convinced the humming sound was coming from a natural phenomenon worth documenting. I should have shut her down, but I didn't. I didn't want to discourage her curiosity. That was my first mistake. That night, the forest turned against us. Beth woke us up around midnight, her screams piercing the silence. I scrambled out of my tent, flashlight in hand, and found her standing by the fire, shaking uncontrollably. "There was someone here," she cried, "standing right there." "Who?" Jordan demanded, scanning the tree line. Beth pointed toward the ravine. "A man. Or, I think it was a man. He was just watching me." I shined my flashlight in the direction she indicated, but there was nothing there, just trees, their shadows dancing in the flickering firelight. "Beth," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "you're tired. Your mind's playing tricks on you." "No," she insisted. "I saw him." Tyler stepped closer, his face pale. "Was he thin?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "With long arms? Did he tilt his head?" Beth nodded, her eyes wide. "How did you—" "I've seen him before," Tyler said, cutting her off. The next morning, Tyler came clean. He wasn't just here for photography. He'd heard about Devil's Wash years ago, a story about a witch who haunted the forest. She was said to be a shapeshifter, able to mimic human voices and movements, luring victims into the ravine. The locals called her the Collector. "I didn't believe it at first," he admitted, "but then I started hearing things, seeing things." "Like last night," Beth said. "The man I saw, it was her, wasn't it?" Tyler nodded grimly. "She's watching us now, and she won't stop until she has what she wants." "That's ridiculous," I snapped. There's no such thing as witches." Tyler's eyes bore into mine. "Do you really believe that?" By midday, we noticed things were missing. Beth's journal had vanished, along with Tyler's spare camera. Our GPS devices stopped working, their screens flickering before going blank. "We should leave," Jordan said. "Now." But the trail back was gone. The markers we'd left, bright orange ribbons tied to branches, had disappeared. It was as though the forest had swallowed them. Then Beth made her second mistake. She wandered off, following the sound of the humming. We found her hours later at the bottom of the ravine. Her body was twisted as though she'd fallen, but there were marks on her neck, long, jagged scratches that didn't make sense. I wanted to believe it was an accident, but deep down, I knew better. "She didn't fall," Tyler said, his voice hollow. "She was dragged." That night, the humming grew louder. It surrounded us, filling the air with a suffocating pressure. Shadows danced at the edge of our firelight, moving in ways that defied logic. And then we saw her. She was pale and impossibly thin, with long, spindly arms and a face that wasn't quite human. Her hollow eyes glowed faintly, and when she smiled, her teeth were jagged and too sharp. "She wants us to follow her," Tyler whispered, "into the ravine." "Like hell we will," Jordan muttered, grabbing a makeshift torch. The witch tilted her head, her movements slow and deliberate. Then she spoke, her voice a haunting mimicry of Beth's. "Help me," she said. "I'm lost." Tyler was the first to go. He chased after her, shouting something about needing to know the truth. We heard his screams minutes later, echoing through the trees. Jordan and I stayed by the fire, clutching torches as the witch circled us. Every time we moved, she moved closer, her hollow eyes fixed on us. "She's trying to break us," Jordan said. "Don't let her." "Easier said than done," I muttered, my voice shaking. The witch lunged, and Jordan swung his torch. The flames seemed to weaken her, forcing her back into the shadows. But we knew it was only a matter of time before she tried again. At first light, we made a run for it. The forest seemed to fight us every step of the way, branches clawing at our clothes, the ground shifting beneath our feet. But somehow we found the trailhead. We never spoke of what happened, not to each other, not to anyone. But I'll never forget the last thing I saw as we left the forest, the witch standing at the edge of the trees, watching us with those hollow eyes, and smiling. My name is Claire Matthews, and I'm 39 years old. This happened last summer during a solo RV trip to Dead Man's Hollow, Oregon. I'm a true crime podcaster, and I was there to research a local legend about a witch accused of cursing the land. It sounded like the perfect spooky story to boost my downloads. I thought it was all just folklore. By the time I left, I wasn't so sure. I parked my RV near the edge of the forest, a little too close to the towering pines for comfort, but the view of the hollow below was breathtaking. The area was silent. No cars, no hikers, not even the distant hum of civilization. It was exactly the kind of isolation I needed to focus on my work. The legend of Dead Man's Hollow fascinated me. According to local lore, Margaret Blackwood, a woman accused of witchcraft in the 1800s, had been executed here after a series of mysterious deaths in the community. Her final words were said to be a curse, condemning the land and anyone who dared disturb her rest. Ghost stories abounded, of course, whispers in the woods, shadows that moved on their own, and violent accidents that befell those who stayed too long. I didn't believe any of it. I'd covered dozens of similar tales before, and they always turned out to be more about human fear than supernatural truth. The first day was uneventful. I recorded some notes and hiked down to the hollow, my equipment packed in a sturdy backpack. The forest was dense and ancient, the trees gnarled and reaching like skeletal fingers. The air felt heavy, but I chalked it up to my own anticipation. Near the center of the hollow, I found what I'd been looking for: a blackened circle of earth surrounded by carved stones. It looked like a fire pit, though far older and oddly precise. I snapped photos and recorded some observations, marveling at how eerie it all felt, even in daylight. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows through the forest. I edited audio clips and prepared for the next day, but as night fell, a strange unease crept in. The wind whispered through the trees, and the silence that followed was too absolute. I laughed it off, but I double-checked the RV's locks before turning in. The first sign that something was wrong came in the middle of the night. A loud thud jolted me awake. My heart pounded as I sat up, listening. Another thud, this time on the roof of the RV, then a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. I grabbed my flashlight and peeked out the window. The clearing was empty. I told myself it was a branch falling or maybe a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I found handprints. Dozens of them, smeared across the windshield and sides of the RV. They were faint, like ash or soot, and they sent a chill through me. I photographed them, thinking it would make for great podcast material, but a part of me wanted to leave right then and there. Still, curiosity won out. That afternoon, I hiked deeper into the hollow. The forest seemed darker, the air heavier. As I walked, I noticed symbols carved into the trees, strange, looping designs I didn't recognize. My skin prickled. It felt like I was trespassing. Halfway through the hike, I met her. Martha. She was sitting on the porch of a decrepit cabin near the edge of the forest. An older woman, maybe in her 60s, with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. She watched me approach but didn't smile. "Not many people come out here," she said as I introduced myself. Her voice was steady, but her tone was wary. I explained my podcast and my interest in the witch legend. She frowned, shaking her head. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "This place isn't safe." I asked her what she meant, but she wouldn't elaborate. Instead, she told me a story. Margaret Blackwood, Martha claimed, wasn't a witch. She was a healer, a midwife who was scapegoated when several children in the community died during an outbreak of disease. The townsfolk burned her alive in Dead Man's Hollow, and her final words were a curse on the land and its people. Martha said she'd grown up hearing the stories, but she'd seen the witch's spirit herself. "She doesn't like strangers," Martha said, "and she doesn't forgive." That night, the unease turned to outright fear. The RV shook violently, waking me from a fitful sleep. The wind outside howled, but it sounded like voices, a chorus of faint, overlapping whispers. My recording equipment, left on to capture ambient sound, flickered with static. When I played it back, I heard something chilling. A woman's voice, low and guttural, repeating a single word: "Leave." The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as shadows flickered outside the windows. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but when I looked out, I saw her. A figure stood at the edge of the forest, shrouded in darkness. She was tall and thin, her features obscured, but her eyes glowed faintly, like embers. The whispers stopped abruptly as she raised a hand and pointed toward the hollow. I didn't sleep after that. At dawn, I returned to Martha's cabin, demanding answers. She seemed unsurprised to see me. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, my voice caught in my throat. "She's warning you. If you stay, she'll do more than scare you." Martha admitted that she was a descendant of Margaret Blackwood. She believed the witch's spirit was protecting her and the hollow, but was vengeful toward outsiders. I accused her of playing into the legend, of trying to scare people away for her own reasons. She didn't deny it, but her final words stuck with me. "You don't have to believe in her. She believes in you." I should have left. Instead, I went back into the hollow, determined to find the source of the legend. I wanted to see if there was any truth to it, or at least get footage that would make for a compelling story. The blackened circle was as eerie as before, but this time it felt alive. The air buzzed with static, and the shadows seemed to shift on their own. As I approached the center, the whispers returned, louder than ever. Then I saw her. Margaret Blackwood's spirit erupted from the circle, a fiery, smoke-like apparition with hollow eyes that burned like coals. Her voice was a guttural roar, the words unintelligible but filled with rage. The ground shook as the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and writhing like living things. "You are no better than they were," she hissed, her voice like crackling fire. "You disturb what you do not understand." I stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but the shadows surrounded me. In a panic, I remembered the carved stones around the circle. I kicked one over, then another, breaking the formation. The apparition screamed, her form flickering like a dying flame. The forest grew still, and the oppressive presence lifted. I ran back to the RV, started the engine, and didn't stop until I was miles away from Dead Man's Hollow. I've never been back. When I listened to my recordings later, I found something chilling. At the end of the final clip, after the static faded, a single whisper remained. "You can't break the curse." I still don't know what to believe. Maybe it was all in my head. Or maybe Margaret Blackwood's spirit is still there, waiting for the next outsider foolish enough to disturb her rest. My name is Ryan Hayes, and I'm 34 years old. This happened last summer, during a solo RV trip I took near Three Rivers, Oregon. I'd been traveling alone for a while, writing articles about hidden wilderness spots and photographing the untamed beauty of the Pacific Northwest. I thought this trip would be no different. 3 days in the quiet, remote forest, far from people and distractions. I was wrong. The drive out was uneventful. I reached a secluded stretch of land near the Deschutes River just before dusk. The forest around me was vast, the air filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was the kind of place where the world felt untouched, and I could hear the whispers of inspiration calling me. I parked my RV in a clearing near the river, surrounded by towering evergreens. The fading sunlight cast long shadows over the campsite, but the beauty of the place outweighed the faint unease that prickled at the back of my mind. "This," I muttered to myself, "is exactly what I need." That first evening, I walked along the riverbank, snapping photos as the light dimmed. The water was calm, reflecting the sky's gradient of deep blues and purples. Everything seemed perfect until I noticed the scratches. They were on the trees near the clearing. Deep, jagged marks that didn't match anything I'd seen before. Too large for a bear and too high up for a coyote. I told myself it was probably nothing, but the unease grew stronger. I took a picture of the marks anyway, thinking it might be an interesting detail for my article. The next morning, I set out on a trail that wound deeper into the forest. My plan was to hike for a few hours, take notes, and return to the RV by lunch. About an hour in, I met her, Jenna. She was sitting on a fallen log near the trailhead, her backpack resting at her feet. She looked to be in her late 20s, with sharp green eyes and a quiet, intense presence. When she noticed me, she smiled faintly and waved. "Hey," I said, feeling a bit awkward. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here." "It's pretty remote," she replied. Her voice was calm but carried an edge, like she knew something I didn't. "What brings you out here?" I explained my writing project and she nodded, her expression unreadable. Then, as if out of nowhere, she said, "Be careful. This forest has a way of making you feel like you're alone when you're not." I laughed nervously. "What do you mean?" She glanced toward the trees, her face shadowed by her hat. "Have you heard of the shadow walkers?" I shook my head, unsure if she was joking or serious. "They're part of the local lore," she said. "Spirits that guard the forest. They don't like people messing with the land. If you see them, well, just don't stay out after dark." She stood and slung her backpack over her shoulder, leaving me with a vague wave and a faint smile. I watched her disappear down the trail, her warning hanging in the air like a storm cloud. By the time I returned to the RV, I'd almost convinced myself Jenna was just trying to mess with me. But that night the whispers started. It began as a faint rustling outside, like wind moving through the trees. But the air was still. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The rustling grew louder, almost like footsteps circling the RV. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty clearing. Still, the sound persisted, just beyond the light's reach. Then I heard it. Soft, indistinct whispers, like voices carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but they sent a chill through me. I slammed the door and locked it, my heart pounding. Maybe Jenna's story had gotten under my skin, or maybe I was just imagining things. Either way, I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I discovered something that made my stomach drop. The ground around the RV was covered in footprints, bare, human-like footprints that led in circles before disappearing into the forest. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had wandered through the campsite while I was asleep. Maybe it was Jenna, pulling some kind of prank. But deep down, I knew something was off. Later that day, I hiked back to the trailhead where I'd met Jenna. She was there again, as if waiting for me. "You heard them, didn't you?" she asked. I hesitated, then nodded. "The whispers? And the footprints?" She frowned. "They're warning you." "Warning me about what?" "The shadow walkers. They're spirits of the forest and they're not happy you're here." I stared at her, trying to gauge if she was serious. "What do they want?" "Respect," she said simply. "They don't want you disturbing the balance." Before I could ask more, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my questions. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from all directions surrounding the RV. The air inside grew cold, and the faint glow of the moon illuminated strange shadows moving outside. Then the knocking started. It was soft at first, a gentle tap-tap-tap against the windows. Then it grew louder, more forceful, until the entire RV seemed to shake. My flashlight flickered as I aimed it toward the window, and that's when I saw them. Silhouettes, tall, human-like figures with glowing eyes standing just beyond the glass. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but their presence was suffocating. I tried to start the RV, but the engine refused to turn over. "Okay," I muttered, my voice shaking. "Okay, what do you want?" The shadows didn't answer, but the knocking stopped. They stood there, watching, until I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my breath visible in the freezing air. The shadows retreated into the forest, their glowing eyes the only sign of their presence. They stayed just beyond the reach of my light, waiting. Desperate, I remembered Jenna's warning about respecting the forest. My mind raced, trying to think of anything I might have done to anger them. Then it hit me. The fire pit. I'd found an old, abandoned fire pit near the river and had cleared it for better photos. Maybe that had been a mistake. Clutching the flashlight, I made my way to the fire pit, the shadows following me silently. I replaced the stones, scattering the ashes back into the soil. Then, feeling foolish but desperate, I whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb this place." The air grew still, and the shadows stopped moving. Slowly, one by one, their glowing eyes faded into the darkness, leaving me alone beneath the stars. The RV started without issue the next morning, and I left Three Rivers as quickly as I could. I never saw Jenna again, though part of me wonders if she was ever real. Weeks later, while editing the photos from the trip, I found something I hadn't noticed before. A single image of the clearing at night with the RV in the background. Standing in a circle around it were the shadow walkers, their glowing eyes fixed on the camera. I don't know if they were protecting the forest or warning me to stay away, but I haven't gone back to Three Rivers since. Some places, I've learned, are meant to be left alone. My name is Maggie Steele, and I'm 29 years old. This happened last October in Tillamook State Forest, Oregon. I've always loved being alone in nature. It's where I feel the most free. My blog, Wandering Wild, is all about exploring hidden gems in the outdoors, places most people overlook. I thought this trip would be just like the others, peaceful, inspiring, and perfect for content. I was wrong. The trip started like any other. I parked my RV in a remote clearing near a small creek, far off the beaten path. It was the kind of place I live for, quiet, untouched, and breathtakingly beautiful. The forest was dense with towering Douglas firs, their needles creating a soft carpet beneath my boots. A gentle mist hung in the air, adding an ethereal quality to the landscape. I couldn't wait to capture it all. I spent the first day scouting the area, taking notes and snapping photos. There wasn't another soul in sight, just the sound of the creek and the occasional bird call. As the sun dipped below the trees, I returned to my RV and set up a small fire to cook dinner. The stars came out in full force, and for a while, everything was perfect, until it wasn't. I was finishing up my meal when I heard the faintest sound, a giggle. It was so soft I thought I'd imagined it at first. I paused, fork halfway to my mouth, and listened. Nothing, just the usual rustling of leaves in the breeze. I shook it off. Maybe a bird or the creek playing tricks on my ears. But as the night wore on, the giggle came back. Louder this time. Higher pitched. It sounded like a child, but that didn't make any sense. I was miles from the nearest campground, and there were no families here, just me. I told myself it was nothing. A trick of the wind, maybe, and went to bed. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to hike deeper into the forest. I brought my camera, a notebook, and enough supplies to last the day. The mist was thicker now, clinging to the ground in pale ribbons. As I made my way along the creek, the laughter followed me. It was faint, always just out of reach, but it was there. I stopped in my tracks and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The only response was the wind rattling the branches overhead. A few hours later, I came across a man sitting by the creek. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a gray beard and a worn flannel jacket. His gear looked as though it had seen better days, and his face was lined with a weariness I couldn't quite place. "Morning," I said, forcing a smile. "Didn't think I'd run into anyone out here." He looked up, his eyes shadowed beneath his hat. "Not many people come this far," he said. "You camping alone?" "Yeah, just me." I immediately regretted admitting that. Something about his demeanor made me uneasy. He nodded slowly as if weighing his next words. "You've heard it, haven't you? The laughter." I froze. "What do you mean?" His expression darkened. "The forest has a way of playing tricks on you, laughing woods, we call it. Some say it's the wind. Others, they say it's something else." I laughed nervously. "Well, it's creepy, but I'm sure it's just the wind." He didn't laugh. "Maybe. But if it's not, you'd best keep your wits about you. Don't let it follow you back." I wanted to press him for more details, but he stood and slung his pack over his shoulder. "Stay safe," he said, before disappearing into the trees. By the time I returned to the RV that evening, the sun was already setting. I couldn't shake Charlie's words, or the growing sense of unease that had been building all day. The giggling seemed louder now, more insistent. It came in bursts, sometimes from the creek, sometimes from the trees. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on editing the photos I'd taken, but the laughter grew so loud I couldn't concentrate. Finally, I snapped. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. "Enough!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the clearing. "Who's out there? Show yourself!" The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. That night, I couldn't sleep. The forest seemed alive, shifting and whispering around me. I locked the RV doors and closed the blinds, trying to shut it all out, but the unease crept in like the mist outside. Sometime around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, crunching on the pine needles. My heart raced. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer and held my breath, waiting. The footsteps circled the RV, pausing occasionally, as if whoever, or whatever it was listening. Then came the laughter again, right outside my window. This time, it was deeper, more guttural, like a twisted imitation of human laughter. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my gear and prepared to leave. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead, even though I'd checked it the night before, and it had been fully charged. Panic set in. I was miles from the nearest road, with no cell service and no way to call for help. I grabbed my map and decided to hike out to the main road. It would take a few hours, but it was my best shot. As I walked, the forest seemed to close in around me. The mist grew thicker, obscuring the trail, and the laughter followed me every step of the way. It was closer now, louder, and it seemed to come from all directions at once. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding. No matter how far I walked, the trail didn't seem to lead anywhere. The trees all looked the same, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. I checked my map again, but it didn't make sense. I should have reached the road by now. That's when I realized I wasn't getting closer. I was walking in circles. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was setting again. I collapsed onto the steps, exhausted and terrified. The laughter was constant now, echoing through the trees like a taunt. I locked myself inside and tried to think. If I couldn't leave, I'd have to wait it out. Someone would come eventually, right? But deep down, I knew no one was coming. That night, the laughter grew louder than ever. It was inside the RV now, coming from the shadows, from the mirrors, from inside my own head. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, small, shadowy figures darting just out of sight. My reflection in the mirror didn't match my movements. It smiled when I didn't. I screamed, throwing the mirror across the room, and the laughter erupted into a deafening cacophony. I fell to the floor, clutching my head, begging it to stop. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the laughter stopped. The silence was absolute. The forest outside was still. My breathing slowed, and I dared to hope it was over. But as I looked out the window, I saw them. Shadowy figures, dozens of them, standing just at the edge of the clearing. Their heads tilted in unison, and they began to laugh. I don't remember what happened next. When I woke up, it was morning, and I was lying on the trail just a few feet from the main road. My RV was gone, along with all my gear. The only thing I had was my camera, which was filled with photos I didn't remember taking. Photos of the forest, of the clearing, of shadowy figures with grotesque, smiling faces. I never went back to Tillamook Forest. I don't know what happened there, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I hear laughter outside my apartment window, and I wonder if it ever really let me go. My name is Noah Carter, and I'm 41 years old. This happened 2 months ago in Umpqua National Forest, Oregon. I'd gone there alone, parking my RV deep in the woods to field test techniques for a new wilderness survival book I was writing. I've spent most of my adult life camping, hiking, and surviving off the grid, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered out there. It was late September, and the forest was just beginning to show the colors of fall. I'd planned to spend a week in the woods, documenting strategies for navigating dense terrain, building temporary shelters, and foraging for edible plants. My RV was my base camp, parked in a clearing far from the main trails. I chose the spot deliberately. It was isolated, and the nearest marked road was at least 5 miles away. The first 3 days were uneventful. I cataloged plants, mapped the area, and cooked over a small campfire each night. The silence of the forest was comforting, like a soft blanket draped over the world. But that sense of peace started to unravel on the 4th day. I was hiking through a particularly dense section of woods when I spotted her, a woman standing in the middle of the trail ahead. She was wearing a bright orange jacket, her auburn hair tied back in a braid. I remember thinking how out of place she looked. No pack, no hiking poles, and no visible water bottle. Just her, staring down at the dirt path as if she'd been frozen there. "Hey!" I called out, breaking the stillness. She didn't startle or turn. Instead, she slowly lifted her head and looked at me. Her eyes were strikingly blue, like 2 shards of ice. She seemed calm, almost too calm. "Be careful where you go," she said. Her voice was soft, but carried easily through the quiet. "There are things here you don't want to find." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, as if checking for something behind her. Then she stepped off the trail and disappeared into the trees. I called after her, but she didn't respond. Her footsteps faded almost immediately, leaving no trace of her passage. I should have felt more alarmed, but I convinced myself she was just another hiker who'd gone off trail. Maybe she was part of a group and didn't want to be bothered. Still, her warning lingered in the back of my mind. That evening, the first strange thing happened. I'd set up a small fire outside the RV and was cooking a simple meal when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. Normally, even in remote places, there's always some background noise. Rustling leaves, chirping crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. But now, there was nothing. The silence was so profound it felt like a weight pressing down on me. Then I heard it. A low creaking sound, like old wood bending under pressure. It was faint but distinct, coming from deeper in the forest. I turned my head, straining to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to move, shifting from one direction to another. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the trees, but the light revealed nothing unusual. I told myself it was just the wind. But there was no wind. The next morning, I decided to explore the area where I'd heard the creaking. I marked my trail with small ribbons of red fabric, tying them to low-hanging branches every few yards. As a survivalist, I knew better than to wander aimlessly, especially in dense forest. I walked for about an hour before I saw it. A staircase. It was just there, in the middle of the woods, completely out of place. It rose about 10 feet into the air with no visible structure supporting it, and the wood looked old and weathered, but strangely intact. There were no signs of wear, no moss or decay, despite the humid environment. The stairs led to nowhere, just an empty space at the top, framed by the treetops. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't possible. There were no buildings in this area, no ruins or signs of human activity, and yet, here it was. I stepped closer, my boots crunching softly on the forest floor. The air around the staircase felt different, heavier, as if it were charged with static electricity. I reached out to touch one of the wooden steps, but a sudden wave of nausea hit me, forcing me to stagger back. My vision blurred for a moment, and I swore I heard whispers, faint and distant, like voices carried on the wind. I turned and walked away as fast as I could, marking my trail back to the RV. But when I looked back over my shoulder, the staircase was gone. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of the light. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, or dehydrated. But that night, the creaking sound returned, louder this time. It seemed to circle my RV, coming from all directions. I locked the doors and turned off the lights, sitting in the dark with my knife in hand, my heart pounding. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the sound of my alarm clock. Daylight filtered through the RV's curtains, and everything seemed normal again. But when I stepped outside, I found something that made my blood run cold. All the red ribbons I'd used to mark my trail had been tied to the RV's door handle. I decided to leave. Whatever was out here, I didn't want to find out. I packed up as quickly as I could and started the RV, but the engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, but it wouldn't turn over. My solar battery pack, which had been fully charged the day before, was inexplicably drained. Panic began to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had enough supplies to last a few more days, and I could hike out to the nearest road if necessary. I just needed to think. That's when she came back. The woman in the orange jacket. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something different about her now, something that made my stomach twist. "You should have left sooner," she said. My throat felt dry. "What's happening here?" She shook her head slowly. "The stairs don't like to be found. And now that you've seen them, they won't let you go." I stepped toward her, but she backed away, melting into the trees like a shadow. I shouted after her, demanding answers, but the only response was the creaking sound, louder than ever. That night, I heard footsteps circling the RV, heavy, deliberate, and impossibly close. I peered through the window but saw nothing. The footsteps grew louder, more frantic, until they stopped abruptly. And then I heard a knock at the door. "Elena?" a voice called out. It wasn't my name, but the voice sounded familiar. It took me a moment to realize why. It was my ex-wife's voice, perfectly mimicked, down to the inflection. I didn't answer. I gripped the knife tighter, my knuckles white. The voice came again, pleading this time. "Please, Noah, let me in. I'm scared." Tears pricked my eyes, but I stayed silent. I knew it wasn't her. It couldn't be. The voice eventually stopped, replaced by a new sound, the creaking of wooden steps. When morning came, I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the clearing. Everything was quiet. But as I turned toward the woods, I saw them again. The stairs. They were closer now, standing at the edge of the clearing like they'd crept closer in the night. I didn't approach them this time. I packed what I could carry and started hiking toward the nearest road, leaving the RV behind. But no matter which direction I went, the forest twisted in on itself, leading me back to the clearing every time. By the third loop, the stairs were in the center of the clearing, waiting for me. I don't remember much about what happened next. I know I climbed the stairs. I didn't want to, but something compelled me, a force stronger than my own will. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. When I reached the top, I saw nothing, just darkness, a void that stretched on forever. And then I woke up, back in the RV. The stairs were gone and the forest felt normal again. I don't know how I escaped. I don't even know if I truly did. But every night since then I've dreamed of the stairs, and the whispers are growing louder. I'm afraid they'll find me again. My name is Elena Ramirez, and I'm 32 years old. This happened in August, during what should have been one of the most beautiful work trips of my career. I'm a freelance nature photographer, always chasing the perfect shot of unspoiled beauty. This time, my destination was Crater Lake National Park in Oregon, a place so breathtaking it hardly seemed real. But now, as I sit in my apartment thousands of miles away, I can't look at the photos from that trip without feeling a chill run down my spine. I arrived at Crater Lake in the late afternoon, the sun casting golden light across the water. The lake's deep blue surface reflected the surrounding cliffs like a mirror, and I felt a surge of excitement. This was why I did what I did. Capturing places like this, places that felt alive in ways I couldn't explain. I had planned to spend 3 nights camping in a secluded spot I'd found online near the Cleetwood Cove Trail. From there, I could photograph both sunrise and the stars above the lake. The first sign of trouble came early, though I brushed it off at the time. My tripod jammed as I tried to set it up, refusing to extend fully. I cursed under my breath and wrestled with it, eventually managing to get it stable. "Great start, Elena," I muttered, shaking my head. I chalked it up to wear and tear, but now I wonder if it was the first warning. That evening, I met Mark Bellinger, one of the park rangers. He was a local, mid-40s, with sun-creased skin and a serious air about him. He stopped by my site while making his rounds and struck up a conversation. "Beautiful spot you've got here," he said, nodding toward the view of the lake. "You here alone?" "Yeah," I replied, "just me and my camera." He hesitated, his brow furrowing. "This area's pretty remote. You're careful, right? Stick to the trails. Don't get too close to the water at night." I laughed nervously. "I'll be fine. I'm used to working in the middle of nowhere." Mark didn't laugh back. "Just keep an eye out, okay? And if you see or hear anything strange, don't go looking for it. Trust me." I wanted to ask what he meant, but he tipped his hat and walked away before I could. That night, I set up my camera to capture the stars over the lake. The stillness was almost unnerving. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the soft lapping of water against the shore. I felt alone in a way that was both freeing and unsettling. I had just started snapping a series of long exposures when I heard it. "Elena." I froze. The voice was faint but unmistakable, someone calling my name. I turned toward the woods, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small in the vast darkness. Nothing, just silence. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was the wind carrying a sound from far away, or my tired mind playing tricks on me. But as I packed up my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The next day, I decided to hike along the shore to scout new angles for my photos. The trail was narrow and overgrown, winding through dense trees before opening up to a small rocky beach. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the damp sand. At first, I thought they were human. but as I looked closer, I realized they were wrong. The toes were elongated, almost claw-like, and they trailed off into the water. A chill ran down my spine, but I convinced myself they were just distorted by the sand. Maybe someone had stepped on a rock, or an animal had wandered through. I took a few photos of the prints and moved on, trying to shake the unease that was growing inside me. That evening, Mark visited my site again. This time, his friendly demeanor was gone. "Did you see anything today?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Just some weird footprints," I admitted. "Why?" Mark's jaw tightened. He glanced over his shoulder as if checking to see if we were alone. "Listen, you need to be careful. The lake, it's not just a lake, there are stories, legends, things the locals don't talk about. People have seen things here, heard things. You don't want to get caught up in it." I stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or be scared. "What kind of things?" Mark shook his head. "Just promise me you'll stay close to your campsite tonight. And if you hear anything, you stay put. Got it?" "Got it," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed him. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard it again. "Elena." This time, the voice was clearer, closer. It sounded like me, but distorted, as if coming through a broken speaker. My skin prickled with goosebumps. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the trees. And then I saw her. Standing at the edge of the lake was a figure that looked exactly like me. Same dark hair, same clothes, but her face was wrong. Her eyes were too wide, her smile too sharp, and her skin seemed to shimmer, as if it wasn't entirely solid. She raised a hand and beckoned me toward her. I stumbled back into the RV, my heart racing. The figure didn't follow, but I could feel her presence, like a pressure against my chest. I locked the door and sat on the floor, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. My rational mind screamed that this couldn't be happening, but every instinct I had told me I was in danger. The next morning, I found claw marks on the side of my RV, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. I drove to the ranger station and found Mark. He looked at me, saw the fear in my eyes, and nodded grimly. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said. I nodded. "What is it?" Mark hesitated, then pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket. "This is a talisman," he said. "It was left behind by the Klamath tribe. They believed the lake was a gateway to another world, and that spirits used it to cross over. That thing you saw, it's trying to lure you in. Don't let it." I wanted to leave right then and there, but I couldn't bring myself to go. I needed to know if I could capture it, prove it existed. That night, I set up my camera one last time, talisman in hand. I told myself I would take a few shots and then leave for good. But the moment I stepped outside, I felt it. The air crackled with electricity and the lake seemed darker, deeper than before. The figure appeared again, standing closer this time. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then she pointed at the water. I snapped a photo, my hands shaking. The flash lit up the night for a split second, and when it faded, she was gone. As I packed up my gear, I felt something grab my arm. I turned to see her face inches from mine, her hollow eyes boring into me. I screamed and swung the talisman at her. She recoiled, letting out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a growl before vanishing into the shadows. I didn't wait to see if she would come back. I jumped into my RV and drove until I was miles away from the park. It's been months since that night, and I still can't explain what happened. The photos I took are blurry, but there's one, just one, that shows a figure standing at the edge of the lake, her face a distorted mirror of mine. I don't go camping alone anymore, and I'll never go back to Crater Lake. My name is Mark Hale. I'm 40 years old, and this happened 2 months ago when I decided to take my RV deep into Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest in Oregon. I'd recently finalized my divorce, a messy, soul-sucking ordeal that left me craving solitude. I bought the RV to escape the noise of my old life and figure out who I was without the constant distractions. The trip was supposed to be a week of fishing, hiking, and clearing my head. It ended with me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. I pulled into the campsite just before sunset, the dense forest casting long shadows across the ground. The Rogue River glistened in the fading light, its current steady and soothing. I parked the RV on a flat patch of dirt overlooking the water and stepped out to breathe in the crisp, pine-scented air. "This is it," I muttered to myself, a fresh start. I spent the evening settling in, unpacking my fishing gear and setting up a small fire. The sound of the river lulled me into a rare sense of peace. I hadn't felt this calm in months. But even as the stars began to appear, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant howls of wildlife. Just silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the steady rush of the river. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I followed a faint trail that wound along the riverbank, my fishing rod slung over my shoulder. After a few minutes, I noticed a man ahead of me, hunched over and gathering firewood. He was wiry, with a weathered face and a long gray beard. "Morning," I called out, waving. He straightened and looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You camping near the river?" "Yeah, just up that way," I said, pointing back toward my RV. The man frowned and shook his head. "You don't want to stay there too long. The Watcher doesn't like company." "The Watcher?" I echoed, trying not to laugh. "Big fella, glowing red eyes. You'll see him if you're not careful." "Is that a local ghost story?" I asked, smirking. The man didn't answer. He just muttered something under his breath and disappeared into the trees. That night, I was sitting by the fire trying to tune out the hermit's warning, when I heard a loud splash from the river. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the water, expecting to see an animal or maybe a fish breaching the surface. But there was nothing, just the ripples spreading outward. I shrugged it off and went back to my seat. But as I sat there, I noticed something odd. My fishing gear, which I'd left propped against a rock, was now scattered across the ground. "Wind," I said aloud, though the air was still. I gathered my gear and went to bed, telling myself it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I went deeper into the forest, following a trail that eventually led me to an abandoned mine entrance hidden beneath overgrown brush. The wooden beams around the opening were rotted, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. As I stood there, trying to decide if I should go in, I heard a faint whisper. It wasn't coming from the mine. It was all around me. "Mark." I froze. "Hello?" No answer. The forest was silent again. When I turned to leave, I saw it. Standing about 50 feet away was a tall, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure vanished. That night, the Watcher came closer. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when my RV began to shake violently. I bolted upright, heart racing, and grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the door. The shaking stopped, but then came the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling the RV. "Who's there?" I shouted, throwing open the door. The footsteps stopped and I saw him again, standing just at the edge of the firelight. The watcher's glowing red eyes bored into me, unblinking. I swung the bat, though he was too far away to hit. The moment I did, he vanished again, leaving me alone in the dark. The next morning, desperate for answers, I returned to the mine. Near the entrance, I found an old, leather-bound journal buried in the dirt. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with cramped handwriting. The journal belonged to a miner named Thomas Avery, who had been part of a crew searching for gold in the late 1800s. The entries grew increasingly frantic, describing how greed and paranoia tore the group apart. In their desperation, they performed a dark ritual to summon a spirit to guard their gold. The final entry read, "The Watcher demands a soul to leave the cursed ground." That night, the Watcher returned with a vengeance. I woke to find him standing at the foot of my bed, his glowing eyes burning like embers in the dark. I scrambled backward, my chest tightening with terror. "You don't belong here," he growled, his voice like grinding stones. The RV shook again, more violently this time. The windows cracked and the lights flickered. I knew I had to act fast. Grabbing the journal, I bolted outside and ran toward the mine. The Watcher pursued me, his footsteps thunderous and relentless. "Leave me alone," I screamed, my voice lost in the wind. When I reached the mine, the spectral figures of the miners appeared, their forms faintly glowing. They surrounded the Watcher, holding him back as I hurled the journal into the mine shaft. The ground trembled, and the Watcher let out a deafening scream before dissolving into the darkness. The miners nodded at me solemnly before fading away, their tormented souls finally at rest. I didn't stay to see what else might happen. At first light, I packed up and drove out of Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest as fast as I could. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, late at night, I see a shadowy figure in the corner of my eye, its red eyes glowing faintly before disappearing. I don't know if I truly escaped the Watcher or if he's still waiting for me to return. My name is Laura Bennett. I'm 32 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened last October when I took my RV to Cape Lookout State Park, Oregon. I needed some solitude after finishing a grueling stint as a travel nurse. Being alone, surrounded by nature, always helped me decompress. I never imagined this trip would push me to the edge of sanity. I arrived at Cape Lookout just as the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the cliffs. The park was nearly empty, which was exactly what I wanted. I parked my RV in a secluded spot near the beach. The crashing waves and salty breeze felt like a balm to my frayed nerves. I had a week off, and I planned to spend it reading, hiking, and maybe finding myself again. That first night was uneventful, peaceful even. I cooked a simple dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and watched the stars emerge through the skylight of my RV. But the next morning, everything began to change. After breakfast, I decided to explore one of the trails that wound along the cliffs. The air was brisk, the kind that fills your lungs with energy. As I walked, I saw a small plaque near the edge of the trail, weathered by time. It marked the site of a shipwreck from 1853. The name of the ship, the Seraphine, was carved into the wood alongside a somber note about the lives lost to the sea. As I stood there reading, I felt a strange chill. Not from the wind, but something deeper, like a ripple of cold radiating through my chest. I shook it off and continued walking, but I couldn't help feeling like I wasn't alone. Then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper in the breeze. I stopped and looked around. "Hello," I called out, but no one was there. Just the waves crashing against the rocks far below. That evening, the wind picked up, howling around my RV. I was reading by the soft glow of a lantern when I thought I saw movement outside. A shadow flitted past the window and my heart jumped. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. There, at the edge of the cliff, stood a small boy. He looked no older than 7 or 8, his hair wet and his clothes ragged, like he'd just climbed out of the ocean. He turned to look at me, his eyes wide and sad. "Hey," I called, panic rising in my chest. "Are you lost?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, he raised one trembling hand and pointed toward the ocean. Then, just like that, he vanished. I ran to the edge, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, nothing. It was as if he'd never been there at all. The next morning, I went to the park's visitor center to report the boy. The ranger on duty, a wiry man in his 40s named Ethan, listened to my story with a furrowed brow. "You say he was pointing to the water?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Do you think he could have fallen in? Should we organize a search?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting to the window. "The tides around here are dangerous, but—" He trailed off. "It's probably nothing. You're not the first person to see something strange near the cliffs." "What do you mean?" Ethan leaned in, his voice low. "People talk about ghosts around here, sailors mostly, lost souls from the shipwrecks." I laughed nervously, but his expression didn't change. "Ghosts? Really?" He shrugged. "Believe what you want. Just don't go near the cliffs after dark." That night, the unease I'd felt since my arrival deepened. My RV, which had been rock solid the first night, started to shake violently, as though a storm had blown in. I ran to the window, but the sky was clear, the stars twinkling overhead. The whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't just coming from the wind, they were inside my RV. I could hear faint voices murmuring my name, overlapping in a chorus of despair. "Stop it!" I yelled, clutching my head. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until I slammed my fists against the walls in desperation. Then, as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor with every light on, shaking and clutching my blanket. I told myself it was stress, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. The next morning, I decided to get answers. I returned to the visitor center, combing through old records and pamphlets about the Seraphine. What I found chilled me to the bone. The ship's captain, Edward Gray, had been a tyrant, known for his cruelty to his crew. When the ship wrecked, only a handful of sailors survived, and they told stories of Captain Gray's madness in his final moments. Before he drowned, he cursed the sea, vowing that no one who set foot on Cape Lookout would ever find peace. As I read, I felt a presence behind me. I turned, expecting to see Ethan, but no one was there. The hairs on my neck stood on end. That night, the ghost of Captain Gray came for me. It started with a pounding on the sides of my RV, so loud and forceful that I thought the walls might cave in. I grabbed the flashlight and flung open the door. But the moment I stepped outside, the wind died, and everything was still. Then I saw him. He was tall and gaunt, his face hollow and sunken. His uniform was soaked, dripping seawater onto the ground. His eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice like gravel scraping against metal. "This is my land. My curse." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in darkness. Before Captain Gray could take another step toward me, the boy appeared again. He stood between us, his small figure almost glowing in the moonlight. "Follow me," the boy whispered, his voice soft but urgent. He turned and ran toward the cliffs. I didn't have time to think. I ran after him, my heart pounding. Captain Gray's footsteps thundered behind me. closer and closer. Just as I reached the edge of the cliff, the boy stopped and pointed to a small, weathered locket half buried in the dirt. I picked it up, and a rush of warmth flooded through me. The locket seemed to pulse with energy, and when I turned to face Captain Gray, he recoiled, his eyes wide with fear. "Your fight is over," I shouted, holding the locket high. The ghost let out a terrible wail, his form twisting and fading until he vanished into the night. By morning, the whispers and shadows were gone. I left Cape Lookout, but the experience stayed with me. The locket now hangs from my rearview mirror, a constant reminder of the nightmare I survived. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the boy standing by the side of the road. He waved once, then disappeared. I don't know if Captain Gray's curse is truly broken, but one thing is certain: I'll never set foot near those cliffs again. My name is Mia Carter, and I'm 27 years old. This happened in October of last year, in the depths of Tillamook Forest, Oregon. My boyfriend Eric and I were on a weekend camping trip that we thought would be just another adventure. Instead, it became the most horrifying experience of my life. Eric is 29, a filmmaker with a small but passionate following on YouTube. He runs a channel called Wilderness Uncut, where he documents remote locations, often spicing up his videos with tales of local legends. I wasn't thrilled when he suggested Tillamook State Forest. I'm a history graduate, so the stories intrigued me, but the tales of hauntings and cursed lands felt too real. Eric, of course, brushed it off as superstition. We left Portland early Saturday morning, the forest wrapped in a cool mist that seemed to cling to everything. Eric was thrilled. "Perfect mood for spooky B-roll," he said, fiddling with his camera as I drove. I rolled my eyes, but his enthusiasm was infectious, at least at first. The hike to Wilson River Trail was harder than I expected. The rain earlier in the week had turned the trail into a slippery mess. Twice, I almost twisted my ankle on the uneven ground. Eric barely noticed. He was too busy filming every moss-covered tree and damp stone. We finally set up camp just before dusk in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. Our tent was old, and I noticed a tear in the fabric as we unpacked. "This is going to be a problem if it rains," I said. "It won't," Eric replied, grinning. "Anyway, it adds to the charm, rustic survival vibes." I let it go, but unease prickled at the back of my neck. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant animal sounds. Just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. I told myself it was because we were far from the main trail. Eric didn't seem to notice. As we ate dinner by the campfire, Eric brought up the legend of the Tillamook Witch. They say she was accused of sorcery in the 1800s, burned alive by her own neighbors. But before she died, she cursed the land, swearing vengeance on anyone who dared disturb her peace. I shivered, not from the cold. "Maybe we shouldn't be here." Eric laughed. "Come on, Mia, it's just a story." The first sign that something was wrong came later that night. I was lying in the tent trying to fall asleep when I heard it. Faint whispers just beyond the clearing. They were too soft to make out, but I could swear they were saying my name. "Mia." I sat up, my heart pounding. "Eric," I whispered. He was already asleep, his breathing slow and steady. I told myself it was just the wind, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I found something near our campsite. A circle of stones, perfectly arranged, with black scorch marks in the center. "Eric," I called, my voice shaky. "Come look at this." He jogged over, camera in hand, and his eyes lit up. "This is amazing. It's like someone was performing a ritual or something." "Yeah." and maybe we shouldn't mess with it." He waved me off, snapping photos and muttering about authentic atmosphere. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trespassing. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to close in around us. Eric was relentless with his camera, dragging me off trail to find the perfect shot. My ankle was sore from the uneven terrain, and I was starting to regret the whole trip. By late afternoon, I spotted something, or someone, in the trees. It was just a shadow at first, but it moved, disappearing behind the trunks. My stomach knotted. "Eric, did you see that?" "See what?" "There was someone there." He squinted into the trees, then shrugged. "Probably just another camper. Relax." But I couldn't. That oppressive silence was back, heavier than before. It felt like the forest was watching us. That night, everything fell apart. I woke up around midnight to find Eric missing. The tent flap was open, and cold air seeped in. "Eric?" I called, crawling out into the dark. I found him standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the woods. His back was to me, his posture stiff, his arms hanging limp at his sides. "Eric?" I said again, louder this time. He didn't respond. I stepped closer, reaching out to touch his shoulder. The moment my fingers brushed him, he turned, his face pale and eyes unfocused. "Mia?" he said, as if waking from a dream. "What are you doing out here?" I demanded, pulling him back toward the tent. I don't know. I just felt like I needed to go." Neither of us slept much after that. The next morning, we decided to leave. I was packing up when I noticed Eric staring at his camera, his face pale. "What is it?" I asked. He handed me the camera. The screen showed footage from the night before, shaky, distorted shots of the forest, interspersed with glimpses of something. A figure in black, standing just beyond the firelight. Her face was gaunt, her eyes glowing faintly. My stomach churned. "Eric? We didn't film this." He didn't respond, just grabbed the tent and stuffed it into his pack. "Let's go." As we hiked back, the forest seemed to warp around us. The path we had followed was gone, replaced by a thick underbrush and gnarled roots. The air was heavy, making it hard to breathe. That's when we saw her. She emerged from the trees, tall and skeletal, her black dress tattered and swaying as if caught in an invisible wind, her eyes locked on Eric, and a smile spread across her cracked lips. "Eric," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves, "come to me." He froze, his expression slack. I grabbed his arm, but he didn't move. "Eric, snap out of it!" I shouted. The witch raised a hand, her fingers long and charred, and Eric stepped toward her like a puppet on strings. Desperate, I dug into my pack and pulled out the iron knife my grandmother had given me. A family heirloom I always carried for protection. I swung it in front of me, and the witch recoiled, hissing like a snake. The sound was deafening, and for a moment, the air seemed to vibrate. Eric stumbled backward, his trance broken. "Run!" I screamed, dragging him behind me. We ran blindly through the forest, the witch's shrieks echoing around us. The trees seemed to shift and close in, but somehow we broke through, stumbling onto the muddy path we'd taken the day before. When we finally reached the car, Eric collapsed into the passenger seat, shaking uncontrollably. I drove as fast as I could, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see her following us. We made it home, but things were never the same. Eric has a hand-shaped scar on his arm, a constant reminder of what happened. He refuses to talk about Tillamook Forest or the witch, but sometimes I catch him staring out the window, his eyes distant. As for me, I can still hear her whispers in my dreams, calling me back to the forest. And some nights, I think about how close I came to losing Eric and wonder if the witch is still out there, waiting for her next victims. My name is Jack Monroe. I'm 41 years old, a retired firefighter turned amateur adventurer. What I'm about to tell you happened last spring during a solo camping trip to Devil's Staircase Wilderness in Oregon. I went looking for a challenge, a chance to test myself against the elements. What I found was something I still can't explain. The trip began like any other. I parked my RV in a clearing just outside the dense forest. The wilderness stretched before me, steep ravines, muddy trails, and thick, tangled brush. Devil's Hollow, as the locals called it, was known for its treacherous terrain. That reputation made it perfect for me. I wanted solitude, a break from the noise of everyday life. The first day passed without incident. I hiked for hours, marveling at the untouched beauty of the forest. The only sign of humanity was an old trail marker, faded and overgrown. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was dipping below the horizon. I made dinner, wrote a few notes for my blog, and settled in for the night. Then the first odd thing happened. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard something outside, a soft scraping sound, like branches brushing against the RV. I dismissed it as the wind and rolled over, but the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing. Just the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. I shook my head, muttered something about raccoons, and went back inside. The next day, I decided to explore deeper into the wilderness. I'd heard about a hidden waterfall, and finding it sounded like the perfect adventure. The trail was rough, barely more than a deer path. Mud clung to my boots, and branches snagged at my jacket. My GPS kept losing signal, but I pressed on, relying on my compass. That's when I met her. She was sitting on a rock beside the trail, tying her bootlaces. A woman in her early 30s with short brown hair and a confident smile. "Hey," she said, "you heading to the waterfall?" "Trying to," I replied, surprised to see someone else out here. "Good luck. It's easy to get lost." She glanced at the map in my hand. "Mind if I take a look?" We chatted briefly. Her name was Dana, and she was an experienced hiker. She warned me about the tricky terrain and mentioned a few landmarks to look for. Then she waved and disappeared down the trail. I never made it to the waterfall. After hours of hiking, I realized I'd lost my way. The forest seemed different, darker, more oppressive. The air felt heavy, as if the trees were pressing in on me. I retraced my steps, but every turn looked the same. Finally, I gave up and returned to the RV. That night, the strange sounds came back. This time, it wasn't just scratching. I heard whispers, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from all around. I told myself it was the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I stepped outside to check the firewood, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tracks in the mud, large, human-like footprints with clawed toes. They circled the RV, then vanished into the trees. The third day began with another unsettling discovery. My RV battery was dead. I had charged it fully before the trip, but now I couldn't even get the lights to flicker. I spent the morning trying to troubleshoot the issue, but nothing worked. Frustrated, I decided to hike back to the trailhead for help. I hadn't gone far when I stumbled across something strange. A backpack lying in the middle of the trail. It was Dana's. Inside, I found a water bottle, a map, and a journal. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. "They're watching me," it read. "Every time I turn around, I see them. Shadow people. I don't know how much longer I can stay ahead of them. I searched the area, but found no sign of her. The forest was silent, unnervingly so. Even the birds seemed to have vanished. By the time I returned to the RV, it was late afternoon. The shadows stretched long and thin, and the whispers had started again. They were louder now, more distinct. My name was among them. "Jack!" they hissed, drawing the syllable out like a serpent's tongue. I locked the RV door and sat with my back against it, knife in hand. Hours passed, but I didn't dare move. Then, just after midnight, the pounding began. It was slow at first, a single knock on the roof. Then another, and another. The RV shook as something heavy climbed onto it. I held my breath, listening to the creak of metal under shifting weight. "Jack," a voice called, low and guttural. "Come out and play." I didn't respond. The pounding grew more intense, shaking the entire vehicle. Shadows flickered in the windows, tall and misshapen. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging the RV into darkness. When dawn finally broke, the noise stopped. I stepped outside, my legs trembling. The ground was littered with claw marks, and deep gouges scored the sides of the RV. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't human. Desperate, I packed what I could carry and started walking. The trail twisted and turned, leading me in circles. No matter which direction I went, I always ended up back at the clearing. Eli found me around noon. He was a grizzled man with a long beard and piercing eyes, emerging from the forest as if he'd been waiting for me. "You shouldn't be here," he said without preamble. "I can't get out," I admitted. He nodded grimly. "The Hollow doesn't let you go easy." Eli explained that Devil's Hollow was cursed, a place where the line between the living and the dead blurred. "You've seen them, haven't you?" he asked. "The shadows?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "They're not shadows," he replied. "They're something worse." That night was the worst. The whispers didn't just surround the RV, they filled it, echoing in my ears no matter how hard I tried to block them out. Objects moved on their own, sliding across the counters. The air grew cold, frost forming on the windows. And then it appeared, a figure tall and black as night standing just outside the window. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. It didn't move, but I felt its presence like a weight on my chest. "Leave me alone," I screamed, lighting a flare and throwing it toward the window. The figure recoiled, dissolving into smoke. Seizing my chance, I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, collapsing in the dirt as a truck approached. The driver helped me into the cab, and I didn't look back as we sped away. The authorities found no trace of my RV or campsite. It was as if I had never been there. I've since abandoned my blog, unable to write about what happened. But sometimes I still hear the whispers in my dreams. And sometimes I think I see shadows where there shouldn't be any. My name is Ethan Harper, and I'm 34 years old. This happened last summer in the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, Oregon. I'd organized a 4-day RV camping trip with my younger brother, Ryan, and 2 of our friends, Maggie and Kim. I wanted to reconnect with Ryan. We'd grown distant over the years, and this trip was supposed to mend that. Looking back, I wish we'd stayed home. We arrived late in the afternoon on the first day, parking the RV in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air smelled of sap and earth, and the forest was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird. It felt peaceful. We set up camp quickly, eager to settle in before dark. The first sign of trouble was small. Our generator refused to start. Without it, we had no power or heat, but I assured everyone it wasn't a big deal. "We're here to rough it, right?" I joked. Ryan rolled his eyes, already regretting his decision to come. We spent the evening around a campfire eating hot dogs and laughing. Even Ryan seemed to relax, though he kept checking his phone for signal, which, of course, wasn't there. That night, as we all drifted off, I heard it. A faint tapping on the roof of the RV. At first, I thought it was just branches swaying in the breeze, but the tapping was rhythmic, deliberate. It stopped as soon as I sat up. I told myself it was nothing and went back to sleep, but deep down, unease had already taken root. The next day, we hiked a trail that wound through dense forest and rocky terrain. Maggie pointed out flowers and birds, her enthusiasm infectious. Ryan grumbled about the lack of Wi-Fi, while Kim wandered ahead, snapping photos and pushing boundaries. "Stay close," I called out to her. "I'm fine," she replied, vanishing around a bend. When we caught up to her, she was standing in a small clearing, staring at an abandoned campsite. Torn tents lay scattered, their fabric shredded. Rusted tools and cookware were arranged in strange, almost ritualistic patterns. "What the hell happened here?" Ryan asked, his voice tinged with unease. "Bear, maybe?" I offered, though the scene felt too deliberate for an animal. Maggie crouched near one of the tents, running her fingers over deep claw marks. "These aren't bear claws," she murmured. We decided to head back, the cheerful mood of the morning replaced by a heavy silence. That evening, Maggie noticed something carved into the trees around our camp. Strange symbols, intricate and foreign. They hadn't been there earlier, and the precision of the carving suggested they weren't made with a casual knife. Kim, ever curious, insisted on photographing them. "This is so cool," she said, oblivious to the unease settling over the rest of us. As darkness fell, the forest seemed to close in. The chirping birds and rustling leaves faded, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sounds were too deliberate. Soft, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Maggie huddled closer to the fire, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Ryan laughed nervously. Probably just the trees creaking. But I knew he didn't believe it. The whispers grew louder, circling our camp. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the woods, catching a glimpse of something tall and thin darting between the trees. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness, but whatever I'd seen was gone. We retreated to the RV, locking the doors and windows. The third day brought heavy fog, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. We decided to cut the trip short, but when I tried to start the RV, it sputtered and died. Frustration bubbled up as I checked the engine, only to find deep, jagged claw marks across the hood. "What the hell did this?" Ryan asked, his voice rising with panic. "I don't know," I admitted, my hands trembling. Kim wandered off again despite my protests, her camera slung over her shoulder. She returned an hour later, clutching a bone. "It's probably from a deer," she said, but her voice wavered. The bone was cracked and blackened, as if it had been burned. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were words, though none of us could understand them. Maggie flipped through a book on folklore she'd brought, her hands shaking. "It's a skinwalker," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan scoffed. "You can't be serious." But the rest of us weren't so quick to dismiss her. The stories she read out loud described a creature that could mimic voices, take on human-like forms, and prey on the isolated. Around midnight, I woke to a soft knock at the RV door. "Ethan, let me in," a voice whispered. It sounded like Maggie, but when I turned, she was still asleep on the couch. My blood ran cold. "Ethan," the voice repeated, more insistent. I grabbed a knife and opened the door just enough to peek outside. A figure stood in the fog, tall and impossibly thin. Its pale skin stretched tightly over its skeletal frame, and its eyes, hollow, glowing, met mine. I couldn't move, I couldn't even scream. The creature stepped closer, its mouth twisting into a grotesque grin. Then it spoke, using Ryan's voice this time. "Come with me, Ethan." I slammed the door and locked it, my heart hammering. The whispers outside turned into guttural growls, and the RV shook as something clawed at the walls. By morning, the forest was eerily silent. We decided to abandon the RV and hike back to the main road. But the forest seemed to shift around us, the trails looping back on themselves. No matter which direction we went, we ended up back at the RV. Kim disappeared during one of these attempts. We found her hours later, standing in a clearing and staring at nothing. Her lips moved, but the words made no sense. When we tried to bring her back, she screamed and fought us, her eyes wild with terror. We made one last attempt to escape, armed with makeshift torches and knives. The creature appeared again, this time blocking our path. Its form shifted as it moved, its limbs jerking unnaturally. Maggie screamed and threw a handful of salt at it, a desperate act based on the folklore she'd read. To our surprise, the creature recoiled, its hollow eyes narrowing. Using fire and salt, we managed to drive it back just enough to break through the forest's grip. When we finally reached the main road, we collapsed in exhaustion, too shaken to speak. We made it out alive, but none of us were the same. Kim never recovered fully. She's quiet now, her once bold personality dulled. Maggie became obsessed with documenting the supernatural, while Ryan, the skeptic, refuses to talk about the trip. As for me, I moved to the city and haven't stepped foot in the wilderness since. Sometimes I still hear whispers at night, faint but familiar. And I can't shake the feeling that the forest let us go because it wanted us to tell its story. I hope you're listening. My name is Emily Parker, and I'm 36 years old. This happened last September at Lost Creek Lake near Prospect, Oregon. I had just gone through a nasty breakup, and as a full-time travel blogger, I thought burying myself in work while surrounded by nature would be the best medicine. It wasn't. What I found there... Well, let me start from the beginning. The trip was supposed to be simple. I'd park my RV at a secluded campsite, spend my days hiking and photographing the lake, and write an article about hidden camping gems in Oregon. Lost Creek Lake looked perfect on paper, scenic, quiet, and off the beaten path. Exactly what I needed. I arrived in the late afternoon. The lake shimmered under a golden sunset, the surrounding pines casting long shadows. My campsite was tucked into a clearing near the water's edge, with just enough room for my RV and a small fire pit. As I unpacked, an older man with a weathered face approached from the shoreline. "Afternoon," he said, tipping his wide-brimmed hat. "Name's Tom. You here alone?" I nodded, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face. "Yeah, just me. Travel blogger." Tom squinted at me like he was trying to decide whether that was a good idea. "You be careful out here. This lake, it's got history." "History?" I asked, intrigued. He gestured toward the water. "Whole town's under there. They flooded it back in the 1920s to make the reservoir. People didn't leave willingly. Some folks say their spirits didn't leave at all." I chuckled nervously, unsure if he was serious or just messing with the city girl. "Thanks for the heads up." He tipped his hat again. "Don't stay too close to the water at night." The first night, everything felt fine, at first. I cooked dinner on my portable stove, watching the stars wink to life above the lake. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. I expected the typical forest sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, but there was nothing. just an eerie stillness. As I settled into bed, I heard it. Faint laughter, like children playing. I froze, my heart thudding. Who brings kids to a place this remote? I peeked out the RV window but saw only the dark expanse of the lake, calm and empty. Just my imagination, I muttered, pulling the blanket over my head. The next day, I decided to explore. The forest trails were overgrown but manageable, and I found a few great spots for photos. Around noon, I stumbled upon something unexpected. A crumbling foundation surrounded by moss-covered bricks. It was the remnants of a building, likely from the old town Tom had mentioned. I crouched to snap a photo, but as I adjusted the lens, I felt something. It wasn't a sound or a sight, more like the prickling sensation of being watched. I stood up quickly, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. I told myself it was just nerves, but my steps quickened as I headed back to the RV. That afternoon, a girl appeared by the lake. She couldn't have been more than 14, with a shock of red hair and a mischievous grin. "Hi," she said, skipping stones across the water. "You camping here?" "Yeah," I replied. "You?" She shook her head. "My parents are fishing. I get bored." We chatted for a bit. Her name was Jessie, and she was a local. But then she said something that made my stomach drop. "The children like you," she said, staring at the lake. "What children?" I asked. She shrugged. "The ones under the water. They come out at night, you know, to play." Her tone was so casual it sent chills down my spine. Before I could ask more, she ran off toward the trees. That night, the strange sounds returned. The laughter was louder now, and accompanied by splashes, as if someone were jumping into the lake. I tried to ignore it, but my curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out of the RV and walked to the water's edge. The lake was still, reflecting the moon like a sheet of glass. But then I saw it, a ripple, moving steadily toward me. My pulse quickened as the ripple grew closer, yet nothing broke the surface. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. Silence. Then a faint giggle behind me. I whipped around, shining the flashlight into the trees, but there was no one there. My hands shook as I hurried back to the RV, locking the door behind me. The third day, things escalated. My camera began to glitch. Photos I took near the lake were distorted. Blurry figures appeared where there shouldn't have been anyone. One image showed what looked like a small child in old-fashioned clothes standing ankle-deep in the water, staring directly at the camera. I tried to rationalize it. "It's just a malfunction," I told myself, "a trick of the light." But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom returned. "You've seen them, haven't you?" he asked bluntly. "Seen what?" "The children." I hesitated, then nodded. Tom sighed. "They're not children, not anymore. They're something else. Lonely, angry. They'll try to take you with them." My stomach churned. How do I make them stop? "Don't let them in, don't follow their voices, and if you're smart, you'll leave before dark." But it was already too late. That night, the knocking began. It was soft at first, just a faint tap-tap-tap on the RV door. I sat frozen, clutching the flashlight. "Emily," a voice called. It sounded like Jessie. "Emily, come outside, we found something cool." I didn't move. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. "Emily, let me in, please." I peeked through the window and my blood ran cold. Standing just outside the door was a girl. Not Jessie, but someone else. She was drenched, her old-fashioned dress clinging to her pale frame. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "Come play with us," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. I screamed, backing away from the door. The RV shook as if something was pounding on it from all sides. Wet footprints appeared on the floor, leading toward my bed. Desperate, I grabbed my camera and threw it out the window toward the lake. "Take it," I shouted. "Just leave me alone." The pounding stopped. The whispers faded. By dawn, the lake was eerily calm. I packed up in record time, not daring to look back as I drove away. When I finally reached cell service, I checked my camera's memory card. The last photo was chilling. A group of children standing on the surface of the lake, their faces turned toward my RV. I never wrote the article about Lost Creek Lake. Some stories aren't meant to be shared. But I'm telling you this because I think the children are still there, waiting for someone else to play with them. If you go, stay away from the water, and whatever you do, don't open the door. My name is Sarah Dawson, and I'm 27 years old. This happened in July of last year during what was supposed to be a weekend of photography and adventure on the Oregon coast. I wish I could say it was just another trip, but it turned into something I still can't explain. A night that has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. It started as a simple idea. Take the RV to Heceta Head, explore the lighthouse, and capture some hauntingly beautiful shots for my blog. My sister Emily, who's 24 and far more superstitious than I am, reluctantly agreed to come along after I begged her. She's always been jumpy about ghosts and the supernatural, but I convinced her it would be fun. Jake, our childhood friend, came too. At 29, he's the sarcastic voice of reason in our group, always eager to dive into local history but quick to roll his eyes at anything paranormal. We arrived late in the afternoon, parking the RV in a small lot nestled between the forest and the cliffs. The lighthouse stood proud and lonely against the overcast sky, its light sweeping slowly across the ocean. I was giddy. The setting was perfect, moody, dramatic, exactly the aesthetic I wanted for my photos. Emily, on the other hand, was already uneasy. "I don't like this place," she murmured, clutching her hoodie tighter. Jake laughed. "It's just a lighthouse, Em. Relax." Still, as we stepped out of the RV and into the salty breeze, even I felt the weight of the place, a stillness in the air as if the world was holding its breath. We spent the first hour exploring the grounds. The lighthouse keeper's house, now a bed and breakfast, sat on a hill nearby. It was picturesque but eerily quiet. There weren't any guests, and the building seemed empty. The trail leading to the cliffs was overgrown, the wind carrying the faint sound of waves crashing below. By the time we reached the lighthouse itself, Emily was already on edge. "Look," she said, pointing to one of the windows. "There's someone up there." Jake and I followed her gaze, but the window was empty. "There's no one here," Jake said. "The place has been automated for years." Emily shook her head, but she didn't argue. I snapped a few photos, the lens struggling to focus. Every shot came out blurry, as if the lighthouse itself didn't want to be captured. As night fell, the eeriness deepened. Emily refused to go back to the lighthouse, so we stayed in the RV, sharing stories over instant coffee and snacks. Jake, ever the skeptic, pulled up his phone and read aloud the legend of the Gray Lady, the ghost said to haunt the lighthouse. "Apparently, she's the spirit of a lighthouse keeper's wife," he said. "Lost her kid to the cliffs. Now she wanders around, mourning, scaring off tourists who get too close." Emily shivered. "You think that's supposed to make me feel better?" "It's just a story," I said, though I couldn't help glancing toward the lighthouse in the distance. Its light swept across the water like a slow, rhythmic pulse, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure at the edge of the cliffs. I dismissed it as my imagination, but Emily wasn't so easily convinced. That night, the first strange thing happened. Around midnight, a cold wind swept through the RV, even though all the windows were closed. Emily woke up panicked, claiming she'd heard sobbing outside. "It was a woman," she said, "right outside the door." Jake groaned. "It's just the wind. Go back to sleep." But then we heard it. A faint, mournful sound drifting through the night. It wasn't the wind. It was too human, too raw. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, Jake close behind me. The night was pitch black, the beam of my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The sobbing stopped the moment we stepped outside. "See?" Jake said, though his voice was quieter now. "Nothing." But when I turned the flashlight toward the sand, I froze. There were footprints. Bare, human footprints leading from the RV toward the lighthouse, but they ended abruptly, as if the person had vanished into thin air. The next day, Emily begged us to leave. "There's something wrong here," she said. "We shouldn't stay." Jake and I brushed her off, though even I was starting to feel uneasy. My camera refused to work properly whenever I aimed it at the lighthouse, and my phone had lost all signal. Jake, always the skeptic, insisted it was just bad luck or coincidence. To lighten the mood, we decided to take a closer look at the lighthouse keeper's house. The front door was unlocked, the inside eerily preserved. Dusty furniture, faded wallpaper, and an old photograph on the mantel. A woman in gray holding a small child. Emily didn't want to go in, so she stayed outside while Jake and I explored. The air inside was cold and stale, the floorboards creaking under our weight. "Creepy, but not haunted," Jake said, snapping a picture of the photograph. Then the door slammed shut behind us. Emily was frantic when we finally managed to open the door again. "I told you not to go in there," she shouted, her eyes wide with fear. "She doesn't want us here." Jake tried to calm her down, but even he seemed shaken. I, on the other hand, was determined to stay. Whatever was happening, I wanted to document it. That night, the Gray Lady made herself known. It started with the sobbing again, louder this time and closer. Then came the knocking. Soft at first, then insistent. When I opened the door, there was no one there. But the temperature dropped so sharply I could see my breath. Emily was crying, begging us to leave, but I couldn't tear myself away. I grabbed my camera and headed toward the lighthouse, Jake reluctantly following. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of salt and decay. The spiral staircase loomed above us, its steps slick with moisture. As we climbed, I felt the weight of something watching us. At the top, we saw her. The Gray Lady stood by the window, her face obscured by a veil of gray fabric. She turned slowly to face us, and though I couldn't see her eyes, I felt her gaze pierce through me. She raised an arm, pointing toward the cliffs. We followed her outside, drawn by something we couldn't explain. Emily was waiting by the RV, but when she saw us, she ran toward the cliffs as if in a trance. "Emily, stop!" Jake shouted, grabbing her arm. "Ah!" She struggled against him, pointing to a spot in the sand. "She's showing me something," Emily said, her voice distant. We started digging, our hands clawing at the damp earth until we uncovered a small rusted box. Inside was a child's toy, broken and covered in dirt. The Gray Lady appeared again, her form shimmering like smoke. She looked at us, her expression softening, and for the first time, the air felt warm. Then she vanished, leaving only the sound of the waves. We left at dawn, too shaken to speak. I reviewed my photos on the drive home and found one that made my blood run cold, a clear image of the Gray Lady staring directly into the lens, her eyes filled with sorrow. I still can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that we were part of something far older and more powerful than ourselves, and I'll never look at the ocean the same way again.